Thank you to our friends out at the detention center for hanging out with us. Also, our extended family in Clinton County at Westview Christian. I want you to know that we're glad that you guys are watching. If you have your Bible or your phone, I want you to go to Matthew chapter 9. Matthew chapter 9. This past week, as many of you know, was fall break for a lot of you, and I hope that if you did go somewhere that you had a great time. I know we've got several that are traveling back today, but if you did any traveling, there's something that you may have noticed, and it's this. It's now common for churches to put what they think are these clever little sayings on their church sign. So when you drive by, you read it, and maybe it makes you to think about something in particular. Maybe it's thought-provoking or whatever. Now, you may be a big fan of those, and if you are, it's great with me. I'm not personally a fan, and I'll tell you why. I always think about all the things that could go wrong. You put something on your sign, maybe it's misspelled, maybe it doesn't sound the way you thought it was going to sound as somebody that was driving by. So those things make me a little bit nervous. There's things that I think are clever that somebody else might not get. So I want to show you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. Here's one from a church I saw recently. Tired of being a loser. Turn to God. I think that's going to be my Easter sermon. I told them in the first service, we're going to do a whole marketing campaign around that phrase, tired of being a loser. Here's the second one. Don't let worries kill you. Let the church help. Now, again, when somebody did that, I'm sure they thought that was a great idea. It's really going to be clever, really going to help a lot of people, but I don't think it came across that way to most people. Here's my favorite one. We love hurting people. Now, if you're a church person, you know what that means. You know what they're trying to communicate. If you were not a church person and you drove by that, 50 miles an hour, it would probably send a different message. Can you imagine the conversation? Honey, I think we should go to church this weekend. Where do you want to go? Well, let's go to the church that loves to hurt people. That sounds, it'd be hard to invite your friends. And then here's one from a church in Lexington, Kentucky. Whoever stole our AC units, keep one. It's hot where you're going. Now, again, I'm sure they're frustrated. I'm sure that's, we've all had stuff taken from us. It's frustrating, but I'm not sure that's the message that you want to send. There's another phrase that you sometimes see on church signs if you're paying attention, and here it is. I'm going to show you this one. Now, you've seen this. Almost every church you drive by has a sign similar to that one that says everybody welcome. It's meant to serve as an invitation. And hey, if you're driving by and you're in our community, you're welcome to attend whatever event we're having. You're welcome to attend one of our services. The problem is, though, that while those words are easily understood, in many cases, they appear to be false advertising. In order to be more accurate, in some places, there should be a disclaimer. There should be some fine print underneath that says everybody's welcome as long as you look like us, believe like us, talk like us, vote like us, hang out in the places that we hang out in, eat at the same restaurants that we eat in, and listen to the same music that we listen to. See, for some people, there's another sign that more accurately describes their church experience, and it's this one. While the sign in front of the church may say that everybody's welcome, too often there's an invisible sign inside the church that lets people know very quickly that unless they fit in, unless they match up in every area, that they're trespassing. That the church is kind of like private property, and you can come, you're welcome as long as you're just like us. But it wasn't always like that. In the business world, there are certain organizations and certain companies that over time have developed what are known as their core values. They're these things that are ingrained in the DNA of these organizations that help them make decisions and help them become who they were meant to be. Sometimes those core values are handed down from a visionary founder. Other times they develop over a long period of time. But in the church, we have our own set of core values that have been handed down from our founder. If you go back to the opening days of what we call the church, or this movement that God was building, that Jesus was building, Jesus' vision for the church was that his kingdom would come and it would be on earth as it is in heaven, that his will would be done. That's what he prayed for. It's what he tells us to pray for. It's what we're to work towards. And in order to see that vision become a reality, almost immediately, Jesus began to put together this team of people who understood that vision and then would work to see that become a reality. When you get to Matthew chapter 9, Jesus chooses a man to be an integral part of his team that most of us would have never chosen. He chooses a guy that most of us probably would have bypassed. Now, to set this up for you, just so you understand where we are, by this point, Jesus has already chosen at least 4 and maybe a few more guys that would be a part of his team. We call them the 12 disciples or the apostles. Most of them were fishermen. He's also, by this point, already been traveling around. He's been teaching these crowds of people. He's been doing these miracles. So everywhere he goes, he's getting a lot of attention. And as Matthew chapter 9 opens, Jesus finds himself in the home of somebody in this little fishing village known as Capernaum. And apparently the room is kind of crowded, so these 4 friends cut a hole in the roof and they lower their buddy down in front of Jesus who's paralyzed. And Jesus, seeing him, heals this man. Now you can imagine that got all kinds of attention. If Jesus was getting attention before, you heal a paralyzed guy with people watching, and the attention just goes off the charts. And then it's not long after that Jesus and his disciples, his entourage, are leaving. They're traveling, and they encounter a man that everybody in that little village knew and that everybody hated. I want you to check out the way Matthew tells the story. Matthew chapter 9, verse 9. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him. Matthew got up and followed him. That's interesting. Look at this story. Keep in mind, this is Matthew telling his own story. This is Matthew thinking back over his life, writing about what it was like when Jesus came out of nowhere and invited him to join in this adventure of a lifetime. But in order to truly understand what's happening in this moment, it's important that you understand who Matthew was before this moment. Now, this is one of those stories that gets repeated in 3 of the 4 Gospels. In Mark and Luke's telling of the story, they refer to Matthew not by the name Matthew, but by his Jewish name, which was Levi. Now, if you grew up in church, you're familiar with the Old Testament, you might remember Levi was the 3rd of Jacob's 12 sons who become the 12 tribes of Israel. In fact, it was that tribe known as the Levites who were to serve as the spiritual leaders of the entire population of the Jewish nation. It was their job to oversee the temple, to lead the worship services, and to offer sacrifices on behalf of God's people. So that was Matthew's heritage. That was the family that he was born into. From the earliest days, from the time he was born, it was just expected that sometime in the future, Matthew would follow in the footsteps of his family and he would become a priest. But like a lot of us, at some point in his life, Matthew's life took a pretty dramatic wrong turn. And we don't know how it happened, and we don't know exactly when it happened, but at some point in his journey, Matthew got off track. He went the wrong direction, and instead of becoming a respected priest, he becomes a hated tax collector. Now, in order to understand why he was so hated, you have to understand that Matthew was just one small part of a system that was completely corrupt. Now, at this point in history, the nation of Israel was living under the authority of the Roman Empire. And Rome ruled the world with an iron fist. At the same time, Rome was continuing to fight battles. They were continuing to conquer new lands. They were trying to expand their empire, so they needed money to fund their expansion and feed their armies and buy their weapons. So in order to raise the needed money, they placed a heavy tax on everybody that lived under their control. And when I say heavy, I mean really heavy. Historians tell us in the 1st century, most people living under the Roman Empire were taxed somewhere between 60 and 80%. Can you imagine that? 60 and 80% went to Rome. In order to collect these taxes, they would set up a system in which the Roman government would auction off a certain tax district, and somebody would buy the right to collect taxes in certain districts. And the reason that people bid on those positions is the way it worked, the Romans would set a certain amount of tax that they wanted to collect from everybody, and then whoever the tax collector was had free reign to extort as much money as they wanted. So if the Romans said, hey, everybody's going to pay 60%, the tax collector could collect the 60% and then say, actually, we're going to collect 65% this year, and he would keep the extra 5% from each person. Rome didn't care as long as they got their money. And the tax collector was allowed to keep whatever was extra, so over time, tax collectors became very wealthy people. So you have this situation in which not only is the tax collector working for the enemy, working for the Romans, he's also literally stealing money from his own people. And people are losing their homes, they're losing their businesses, they're losing their savings because the tax collectors keep demanding more and more and more. So to say that a tax collector was hated would be an understatement. Because of their standing in the community, tax collectors were not allowed to testify in court because they were seen as inherently dishonest. Because they were considered unclean, most people wouldn't eat with them, they wouldn't talk to them, they wouldn't even look at them if they could help it. They were so despised that even the word tax collector was sometimes replaced with the title enforcer of injustice. And that's Matthew. In fact, there's a phrase you see sometimes in the Bible, especially the New Testament, that goes like this. It says sinners and tax collectors. Now, first you read that, you're like, well, that's kind of weird because we're all sinners. I mean, we're all in the same category. But when you understand the history of it, it makes sense. In the first century world, tax collectors were their own category. I mean, they were so bad that they sort of stood out from the crowd. So somebody could say, you know what, I'm a terrible sinner and I've done terrible things, but at least I'm not a tax collector. I mean, the tax collector, that was the bottom rung of the ladder. That was as low as you could go. There was nobody beneath you in the entire culture. And that was where Matthew was. But he didn't start there. Remember, at one time, he'd been on track to become a priest. But then he got off track. And I don't think he ever forgot that. One writer said it like this: his guilt followed him around like a shadow. Every time he wrote his name, he was reminded of what he'd become in contrast to who he was born to be. Every day was a reminder for Matthew of how far he'd fallen and how messed up he was. But then on one particular day, Jesus shows up and he sees Matthew sitting there, and of all things, he invites Matthew to come and be a part of this team that he's putting together. And you can almost hear the other guys. I mean, they're seeing all this. Here's these fishermen, these businessmen, these respected guys, and they see Jesus invite Matthew to be a part of the same team that they're on. And what are they thinking? Jesus, you can't be serious about this. I mean, there's a lot of other people you can invite, Jesus, but don't invite Matthew. There's no way that he can be on the same team that I'm on. You can't be serious with this. But as they soon learned, Jesus was really serious. By inviting a man like Matthew to join his team, Jesus is very clearly demonstrating to his disciples and to us, his followers, that this movement that he's building is not just for the all-stars, and it's not just for the people on the honor roll, and it's not just for people who have it all together. Instead, it's a movement that's open to everybody. Now, that's the way it started, and that's the way it was always intended to be. And yet, you know that today doesn't always feel like that. A few months ago, my friend John Hampton was here, and he shared a message when he talked about 3 core values. He called them signs of a growing church. He said it like this: everybody's welcome, nobody's perfect, and through Jesus, anything is possible. Now, if you weren't paying attention, we soon put those on the outside wall of our lobby there, sort of as a silent reminder of what we've been called to. But today, and for the next few weeks, we're going to really focus in on what it would mean to see those things become a reality in the life of our church. So the question today is, what would it look like if our church was a place where everybody was truly welcome? And you see the answer to that in Matthew chapter 9. There are 3 things that define a church where everybody's welcome. If you're keeping track on your bulletin, here's the first one. A church where everybody's welcome focuses on a simple invitation. And here it is. You follow him. He says to us, follow me. That's the message. Now, I said earlier, sometimes in churches, I'm afraid that we're guilty of false advertising. Something else we're sometimes guilty of is mixed messages. I have another picture I want to show you. This was taken by a guy named Dan Wunderlich during a trip to the Holy Land last year. He was on one of these tour groups, and they came to the place, they called this the Mount of the Beatitudes. It's the traditional site where Jesus is believed to have given the Sermon on the Mount. Now, if you can see in this picture, someone's taken the words from John 7:37 and put them on a plaque. It says, "Let anyone who thirsts come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as Scripture says, rivers of living water flow from within him." So you've heard that before. A couple feet away, though, is a little sign that you see that says, "Water not for drink." Now, you see a scripture that says, hey, everybody can come and drink from this. It's free. This is the fountain of life. Everybody's welcome. And a couple feet away, it says, yeah, everybody's welcome, except you can't drink this water. It's kind of like an everybody's welcome sign next to a no trespassing sign. You see it, and you're not sure what you're supposed to think or what you're supposed to do. And unfortunately, in the church world, we're sometimes experts at sending mixed messages. For example, we say things like, hey, come as you are. When in reality, there are certain churches that mean, come as you are, but when you come, we're not going to talk to you unless you're dressed like us, believe like us, and behave like us. Or we say, hey, we're a loving church. But what sometimes gets communicated by our actions is, hey, we're a loving church unless you're divorced, addicted, unemployed, or come from a dysfunctional family. Then there are churches that talk a lot about, reaching the unchurched, and they turn around and they make every decision based on what the people who are already there would prefer. Or the churches that talk a lot about, grace is a free gift, but here's a list of 25 things you need to stop doing and 30 things you need to start doing in order to be pleasing to God. And because of that, it's no wonder that so many people are confused about what it means to follow Jesus. But when you look at Jesus' invitation to Matthew, there's no confusion. There's no mixed messages. It's all very straightforward. He looks at this guy whom everybody else had ignored, and he says to him, "Follow me." In other words, he's saying to him, Matthew, hey, I want to be in a relationship with you. I want to grow closer to you. And I know about your past. I know about all the terrible things you're involved in. I know how you've cheated and lied and ripped people off and all of that, but I still want you to be a part of this team that I'm building. Now, nobody who was watching that could believe what they were seeing. Now, if you don't get how scandalous this was, then you don't understand the story, because this is a story, this was a moment that went against everything that people thought they knew about relating to God and following God. But Jesus extends this invitation that nobody can believe, and then in one incredible moment, it says Matthew got up and he followed him. And the Greek word there that gets translated got up is the same word the Bible uses for the word resurrection. It's a personal resurrection. It's as if in that moment, Matthew himself was resurrected. I mean, in one moment, he moved from death to life. But here's what I want you to catch. At that moment, when Jesus came along, Matthew was one invitation away from experiencing a brand new life. He was one ask away from the kingdom of God. And here's the deal. You never know who's in your world already. People you work with, people you hang out with, the people that your kids play ball with, who's just one invitation away, man. They're just one ask away from a whole new life because of one question. And Matthew sees his opportunity, and it doesn't take him but a second to jump, and he gets up from his seat and he leaves everything behind. He leaves his identity, his past, his career, even his financial future in order to follow Jesus. And at that point, the story takes an even more dramatic turn, because Matthew's so excited that he invites Jesus over to his house and he throws a party. Check out verse 10. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. So when you have a party at your house, who do you invite? You invite the people that you want to hang out with, your friends, a few select family members, some neighbors that have become friends. I mean, you invite the people that you want to hang out with. The only problem is, because of Matthew's reputation, the only friends that Matthew has are other people like him. All the good people, the religious people and the church-going people, they won't have anything to do with Matthew, so they're not getting invited. So who goes to the party at the home of a tax collector? Other tax collectors and prostitutes and corrupt politicians and people with bad reputations. I mean, this is not the Sunday school crowd. And my favorite part of the story is that right in the middle of all these people, the amazing thing is that Jesus is right at home. One preacher said it like this: Jesus liked people that weren't like him, and people that weren't like Jesus liked Jesus. There was something about his personality that drew these people to him. That's the second thing, if you're keeping track. A church where everybody's welcome is a church that continually invests in relationships with lost people. In the first century world, the act of eating a meal together was more than just eating a meal. It was seen as a symbol of friendship, the symbol of a growing relationship. And by sitting down at the table with these people, Jesus was very purposefully communicating to them that he cared about them, that he valued them. Now, the religious guys and the guys running the temple, they may have not cared. They didn't value these people, but Jesus did. He was worried about them and what would happen to them. And even though he was busy, even though he had a lot of places he could go, a lot of people vying for his attention, Jesus took the time to build relationships with people who were far from God. Now, for most people in most churches, this is an ongoing challenge. Because here's what tends to happen, especially if you grew up going to church, if you've been in church for a long time, what tends to happen is that the longer you're involved in a church, the smaller your circle gets. And it just gets smaller and smaller until you look up one day and you're spending most of your time, and most of the people you're communicating with are other church people. And it's people you go to Sunday school with, and we got the connect groups tonight, and there's value in that, don't get me wrong. But what you have to continually guard against is that you're spending all of your time connecting with people who are already found to the neglect of building relationships with people who are lost. Jesus spends time with the people that the religious people ignored. So I want you to ask yourself, when's the last time I invited somebody out to lunch or played golf with somebody or went to a movie or watched a game or whatever it is I like to do? When's the last time I invited somebody who was lost to do that with me? When's the last time I called on the phone or text somebody and invited them to do something, not because I want to preach a sermon at them, not because I'm going to invite the preacher over so he can really, put it to them. I'm just going to hang out with them and hopefully over the course of the relationship move them a little bit closer to Jesus. And if you just do what Jesus did, you don't have to be weird about it. You just have to hang out with some people. But I want to warn you, when you do this, you're going to face some criticism. I want you to look at what happens in verse 11. When the Pharisees, dun, 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 whenever you read the word Pharisees, you should think that, because they're the law and order party, man. These are the guys that are worried about the rules. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Now, during that time period, these banquets and dinner parties would be held in these open-air courtyards that were part of people's homes. So whenever somebody hosted an event, there were people on the outside who could walk by. That's what's happening. Jesus is sitting there at Matthew's house. He's got all these, colorful people surrounding him, and the Pharisees, they're out there, and they're looking who's on the guest list and who's not on the guest list, and they're keeping track of everybody that's there and everything that's going on. And they look in, and they see what's happening, and they have a hard time processing what they're seeing because they see Jesus, and instead of lecturing these people about everything they're doing wrong, what's he doing? He's just hanging out with them. And again, the Pharisees can't process this. I mean, they've spent their whole lives trying to avoid these people, and now they see Jesus, and he's sitting there, and it blows up everything that they think they knew. So they go to his disciples. Now, notice they don't go to Jesus. They go to his disciples, and they ask them the question, "Why does your teacher hang out with people like that? Why is he eating with those people?" Now, one thing you have to understand, whenever you make this a priority, or a church makes this a priority of reaching lost people, you're going to inevitably face some criticism. That's just part of the deal. And just like in Jesus' day, most of the criticism will come from other religious people. I don't know why that is, but that always seems to be the case. And sometimes they'll even verbalize it and they'll ask questions like the Pharisees did. Why are you always talking about inviting people to church? Why do we have to do so many community events? Why do you all spend so much money advertising and building buildings? Why do we put so much emphasis on children's ministry? Why are we always talking about serving the community? You'll hear all these questions. And those are the kinds of questions you get when you make a decision that you're going to do your best to do the one thing that Jesus told us to do. Now, if you look at verse 12, Jesus answers the Pharisees' question. He hears the question and he answers it. Check this out. On hearing this, Jesus said, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." In answer to their question, Jesus makes it clear that the people that they've spent their life avoiding are the reason he came in the first place. Make sure you understand. Jesus didn't come to earth to help good people become better people. And he didn't come to earth so that he could hang out with self-righteous people who already thought they had it all together. He came to help people who were messed up and knew they were messed up and experience a fresh start. So if you're already healthy and you don't think you need a doctor, there's not much Jesus can do for you. But if you're sick and you know you're sick, he's got everything you need. Then when you get to verse 13, Jesus invites these religious leaders to join him. And he says, go and learn. Now here these guys, man, they've got a PhD in the Old Testament, and yet somehow they missed the point to the whole thing. If you're still keeping track, here's the third thing. A church where everybody's welcome is a church that extends love to sinful people. The religious guys, man, they were worried about making sure everybody measured up. They were concerned making sure everybody followed all the rules and offered all the right sacrifices, but not Jesus. Jesus is more concerned with extending mercy. And the Greek words there are the same word for love or compassion. Jesus' entire mission from the day he got here has been about pursuing lost people and inviting them to experience a fresh start and enter into his kingdom. That's always been the mission. The mission was never to help good people become better people. The mission has always been to help people who are spiritually dead become spiritually alive. So as we close today, there's two really important questions I want you to ask yourself. Here's the first one. Ask yourself, am I following? It could be for some of you here this morning that you're a lot like Matthew was up until this point in his life. You've been doing your own thing. Or maybe you're here and you're not even sure that you're invited to the party. And as you read through the Bible, one of the things you see over and over and over again is that Jesus welcomed people that nobody else would welcome. He invited people to the party that nobody else invited. Gentiles, pagans, Samaritans, prostitutes, tax collectors, lepers, sinners, Romans, soldiers, slaves, cheats, adulterers, demon-possessed, unclean, unwashed, unloved, and even a thief on a cross. He was all the time inviting people inside the circle who felt like they were condemned to spend their lives outside the circle. But here's the really cool part. The only requirement to being invited to the party is that you have to realize you're messed up. That's it. In order to accept his invitation, you first have to admit you're sick. That's the only prerequisite. Because it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. So if you're here and you know you're a sinner, then I want you to know that you're invited. It's as simple as that. In just a minute, we're going to have an invitation song. As Austin said, we've had people responding to the invitation all week long. It's been awesome. Kent, Gwen, yesterday, the guys at the detention center. I want you to know, you have a seat at God's table. You have a seat at God's table. I want you to stand with me. And there's one more question I want you to ask yourself. First one is, am I following? The second is, am I inviting? See, the mistake that the Pharisees made, it's a mistake that a lot of us make, is we sometimes think after we've been adopted into the family, you reach this point where you think it's about you. So the Pharisees they had their seat at the table. So all of a sudden now God's most concerned about me and what I've got going on. And they begin to think that God's main concern was what they were doing and not God using them to reach other people. That's why Jesus said to them, I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. And that Greek word to call literally means to invite. So if you're a follower of Jesus, by definition, your job is to invite other people to follow Jesus. And the question is, well, who am I supposed to invite? Everybody. Believers, unbelievers, skeptics, mockers, Republicans, Democrats, independents, young people, old people, people in suits and people in skinny jeans and people with wrinkled skin and tattooed skin and people with every color of skin, people of every language, respectable people, shady people, addicted people, messed up people, straight people, gay people, married people, divorced people, and unaffiliated people. It's everybody. And it doesn't mean that everybody's right, and it doesn't mean that anything goes, but it does mean that everybody's invited. Regardless of where they're coming from, regardless of what their past looks like, everybody's welcome to repent of their sins and enter the kingdom of God. That's our mission. Jesus said that he was going to build a movement in which everybody's welcome. And if there's one sign that I hope becomes the sign that defines our church, it's this one. And I want you to notice it just says everybody's welcome, and if I could, I'd put a period at the end of that. Because there's no fine print, there's no disclaimers, there's no tests you have to pass in order to see if it's true. It's just everybody's welcome, period, the end. And that's my dream. And I hope it's your dream too. As you can see, we've got some folks that are going to get baptized here in a minute. And we talked about this some on Wednesday night. I went down to the youth group. We talked about it. Austin's doing a great job. And their parents have done a great job. One of the things we talked about on Wednesday night is it's one thing to know you should do something. It's something totally different to actually do it. You know what I mean? There's a lot of things I know I should do. Some things I don't get around to doing. But there's a few things that you know you should do that if you don't get around to doing it, it's not going to be good for you. And we've had 6 of them that decided to do it. 1 yesterday and 5 today. But I want you to know, some of you are in the same boat. There's some stuff that you know you should do, and there's some decisions that you know you should make. And I'm just going to be honest with you. I don't know what you're waiting on. We can help you today. We can help you tonight. You call me at 2 o'clock in the morning, we'll help you. But don't put it off. We're going to sing an invitation song. And if you need to talk to somebody, you need to pray with somebody, you just meet us down here.